We are recording. Sure, we can probably get started.
Okay. Yeah, so welcome back to the Agroforestry Northwest Workgroup, everyone. Hopefully everyone had a great summer. If you're new to the group and you're just joining us, or just as a reminder, we typically start this session with a guest speaker. And we have an amazing guest speaker with us today, and I'll let Patrick introduce her in a moment. And then we have some time for questions around the presentation. And then at the end, we do have an extra sort of half hour for people to hang out and have conversations about a topic, ask questions, share knowledge and resources, maybe share projects that you're working on, and all of that kind of thing. So if you can hang out with us for that kind of last half hour and do some networking, and we can introduce each other and all of that kind of thing at that point. I am going to start out with just a few quick announcements, kind of for the good of the group. And then I will open it up for anyone else who might have some quick announcements, and then we will launch into our presentation. So just want to bring to everyone's attention a couple of things. Coming up in early December, the Savannah Institute, we will be hosting the Perennial Farm Gathering. And if you've never attended this, this is essentially like an agroforestry annual get together. It's all virtual. It's for 3 days. I believe it's December 6th through 8th. And yeah, people kind of from all over the country kind of get together in this virtual space, and they talk about agroforestry and they share projects and experience and all of that kind of thing. So it's kind of a cool thing to attend if you've never done it before. I will put the link to that in the chat because their early registration is open. So yeah, if you're interested in checking that out. I will say their keynote speakers this year are Dr. Robin Wall Kimmerer and oh gosh, who was the other guy? And Ross Gay. Yeah, so both of these people are really great writers, really deep thinkers. So might be a very cool event. One other thing I just kind of want to mention too is that there are all these amazing funding opportunities out there right now for agroforestry. WSDA Specialty Crop Block Grant, SARE grants, and all kinds of other funding as well that we might not typically think of for agroforestry, but I think there's some great funding opportunities at the moment. So just, if you're looking to do projects, if you're looking to do outreach and education around agroforestry, be aware that a lot of these things are open at the moment. NACD has a climate smart commodities opportunity out there at the moment. And there are a lot of others. So yeah, if you're interested in some of the other opportunities, reach out and we can talk about that. Does anyone else have any announcements for the good of the group at this point? And if not, then we can turn it over to Patrick.
I just want to add, in the vein of agroforestry programs, conferences, workshops, stuff. The Association for Temperate Agroforestry is going to be having their biennial conference in February of this year. It's actually going to be in Costa Rica. So depending on how you feel about that, it could be a great opportunity to get to Costa Rica in the winter. But there will also be an online option as well, or to participate remotely. So I don't think registration is open for that yet, but it's going to be out soon.
Great. If there's no other announcements, why don't you go ahead and introduce our guest speaker, Patrick?
Perfect.
Can I chime in real quick, Patrick? This is Hollis.
Oh, sure. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I couldn't find a way to raise my hand. I'm just on my phone. I mean, if we're talking about conferences, SAF National Convention is coming up at the end of the month. And there's going to be some meetings and talks with the Agroforestry Working Group there as well. I'll be attending. So if anyone else is attending, I'd love to connect with you beforehand.
That's a really good point. Thanks, Hollis. I'm not able to go to that, but I'm glad we'll have some representation at the work group there. All right. Well, if there's no one else, I will go ahead and get Stephanie started here. We are very, very fortunate to have Stephanie here to talk to us today. Dr. Stephanie Chizmar is with the Southern Research Station of the U.S. Forest Service, and she studies forest-based disturbances and forest products, markets, trades, things like forest carbon offsets, land use policy. I hope I'm not doing a disservice to you, Stephanie, but you have a long bio on your website. You do a lot of really cool stuff. So I will let you really get into your work. But the basic idea of what we wanted to talk about today was how land use policy can affect agroforestry, and also touch a little bit on carbon offset programs. I know those are very new, so we might not dig into those too much, but it will be exciting to hear about what might be coming down the pipe. So with that, I'll give it over to you, Stephanie.
Okay, thank you for that great introduction. Let me make sure, see if I can get back to my actual PowerPoint that's already presented. All right, are you seeing the PowerPoint in presenter view? It's loading. Okay, there we go.
Perfect.
Okay, well, thank you for the invitation to speak with you all. Thank you for the introduction. Those bios are always a fun activity to write about or try to condense all the interests that you have or passions that you have with your research. And for me, I always struggle because I have a lot of different interests. But today I'm going to talk about two that I have analyzed over several years through my master's research into my current work. So I'll be speaking about agroforestry programs and incentive programs, or agroforestry systems and incentive programs. So one part of land use policy, and I'll mention kind of which part obviously I'm missing in my presentation. But just as a forewarning, I am a research economist. I am not a tax or legal professional. So all of what I'm going to be presenting on today is a reflection of what I've inferred from through research methods and should not be taken as a reflection of U.S. government policy or as legal or tax advice. Okay, so the vast majority of what I'm going to speak about today relates to a project that I initiated in my PhD, but I am now working on the second phase of it. So I'll produce some background or introduce some background on agroforestry as well as the specific type of incentive program that I assessed, the pilot phase, so the methodology and objectives, as well as some results. I'll discuss some general takeaways, and then I want to discuss findings from a case study that's relevant for you all related to Oregon's property tax programs. And then I'll go into a little bit about the second phase, just how it's changed, how I've adapted the methodology. I unfortunately don't have results from a state in your region for that phase, but I can at least show you an example of Alabama. And then I'll close with some information, hopefully optimistic, but somewhat limited, related to other opportunities such as carbon markets for agroforestry adopters and producers. So we're all here today and quite aware of agroforestry. So one of the key characteristics that can be problematic, or I guess could lead to research questions of agroforestry, is its strategic and intentional integrated nature. And so obviously we're seeing strategic combinations of both agriculture and forestry in the same space. And land use policy may or may not recognize that we can have this integration in the same acres. I only looked at the 5 kind of general classifications or practices of agroforestry defined by the USDA National Agroforestry Center, since they were a major partner of my project. But specifically, I looked at alley cropping, forest farming, riparian forest buffers, shelter belts, and civil pasture. I had mentioned at the beginning that part of my presentation is going to, well, the land use policy, the whole kind of landscape of it is somewhat missing because I don't necessarily look at regulatory policies or planning requirements. And so I generally focus on those that have a more, I guess, direct, obvious economic component in the sense of incentive programs. So using any types of policy or programs that use financial instruments to change costs and benefits of land use, as opposed to strict or not strict harvesting guidelines, prescribed fire rules, things that are more on the that do not have an incentive program, or if the incentive is just to abide by the law and not necessarily a monetary benefit. So financial instruments are grouped into 2 different categories largely when it comes to land use policy. That's going to be fiscal or tax policies. I've generally worked with reducing property tax liability through preferential property tax programs, and hence what I'm going to talk about today. But there's still important benefits for income taxes, especially if you're reforesting. And I'm not going to mention in this specific project. I've also completed research related to more to direct payments. So I'll back up a step. Fiscal tax policies are generally going to be provided by governments, so public entities, whereas direct payments mostly come from public entities, but they also can come from non-public institutions, such as non-governmental organizations or even private companies. And these may come in the form as a one-time reimbursement, such as a cost share reimbursement for to cover a percentage or all of the cost of a specific activity when completed, or maybe a periodic payment, which is where your payments for ecosystem services may fall, including carbon. And this is where you may see them generally over a certain contract period of predefined increment of annual or semi-annual payments for a specific service or good that's being provided. And the reason why these are generally seen or needed, could be argued to be needed, is because forests produce more generally than agriculture, but forests generally produce public goods and services. So those that the society tends to benefit from disproportionately more than the private citizen. And so basically a private landowner is expending to plant trees, so absorbing the entire cost, depending on if they're getting assistance. And that tree is going to, or those trees are going to do a lot of services and provide goods and services to society, and not just him or that landowner. That would potentially, when you sell the timber or whatever leases for different recreation, that you would see those public services incorporated into that cost or price that you would charge. So financial instruments try to encourage specific land management activities or keeping land intact as its current working land use through reducing costs or increasing revenue to landowners. As I had mentioned, I'm going to focus specifically on preferential property tax programs for the majority of this presentation. And I looked specifically at property tax programs for both agriculture and forestry, since agroforestry could technically fall, or my question was, could it fall in one of these? Because I don't see too many property tax programs that are specifically for agroforestry. And these act by trying to balance the taxable value of your property with its income producing potential. And so for those of us that are paying taxes on real property, we are aware that we generally are paying based on the value of property that's determined from similar properties in the region. So it's not necessarily an indication of what your property can earn. And a lot of times it's based on highest and best use, which if you're near urban fringe, or even if you're not, generally could be development over an agricultural use or a forest related use. And so these programs help to try to reduce that taxable value so it matches what you're able to earn from that specific land use without having to hopefully convert it. And these types of financial instruments or incentive programs generally are considered gateway programs. So we attract landowners by offering some economic incentive, but generally they will tend to partner, especially on the forestry related side, maybe a little bit less so on the agriculture side, but they'll generally partner that economic benefit with technical knowledge or some kind of exchange where they're informing the landowner about sustainable forest practices or soil and water conservation for agriculture. So generally some of these programs will have a requirement for a written management plan, for example. And again, this all brings it back to that one of those first slides that I presented. And my research question is how this integrated nature of agroforestry systems may or may not work with these pre-existing programs that are generally defined for a specific land use, whether that be agriculture or forestry, or sometimes if they consider forestry as agricultural use, that specific type of land use, but not necessarily this integrated mixed land use. And just a little bit more background on property taxes and how they reduce that taxable value. There's generally 3 different ways that these programs or policies can reduce that taxable, that tax liability. And so there's modified rate assessments. This is changing the value of the property. We usually send this in terms of like current use value or present use value in forestry, where we're discounting that present or that future value or that future income of timber into what it would be today in a comparable term. And it's more easily understood for agriculture because generally they use cash rents because you're earning income every year or about every year, sometimes multiple times a year. And so a lot of this has to do with the productivity potential of your land and then adding a price to that, what you're able to produce in volume. There's also exemptions, which to the landowner, it may be the ideal situation because you're removing your land from the tax roll itself and not having to pay property taxes. There's also flat taxes, and this is where you have a predetermined fixed rate depending on your specific land use classification. And lastly, there could be a situation where you have both a modified rate and a flat tax. So in my pilot phase, I was a little bit strategic in which states that I chose. I obviously wanted representation across the country as much as I could, but I recognized that this topic area is very, very niche. So I'm looking at property taxes and as well as agroforestry. And so I wanted to organize some focus group discussions with experts. And so my sample of individuals to pull from was quite limited because I was looking for individuals that were familiar with their state or region's agroforestry practices, but then also could be have some working knowledge of what obstacles or opportunities existed related to property taxation. And so working with the National Agroforestry Center, we identified 7 experts across the Northwest. So Oregon, there was some representation in Washington State as well, Nebraska, Wisconsin, New York, and North Carolina. And so I chose those states because I wanted to utilize our focus group participants to inform me about, again, those practices as well as programs, but also as as a reference for when I completed my, had some findings, had some results that I could send those over to that individual and make sure that I inferred accurately the findings that I found. Because this was somewhat difficult since not generally agroforestry is discussed specifically and property tax documents. And so I was also tasked with trying to then adapt the methodology that I utilized to identify barriers and opportunities for agroforestry producers to participate in these programs for the remaining 45 states. And from this map, you can see that Oregon is a little bit of an outlier. It has 4 programs for forestry and agriculture, whereas Wisconsin and New York both have 2 each. So 1 for agriculture, 1 for forestry. And then Nebraska and North Carolina have 1 program that has multiple land use classifications covered. And once I identified my states, I again utilize those focus group discussions to inform a lot of the background information, as well as identify documents to analyze. So there's a few different types of documents that I collected to try to extract information. They include documents that are generally produced or published for county assessors to have a standardized framework of assessing property, whether that's forestry or just real property in general. So those are generally kind of grouped as property tax manuals and guides. Not all states have these that are public, but a lot do. There's also the statutes. So when I'm feeling really excited, I go work on this phase 2, where I'm literally trying to read property tax law and understand its characteristics of its land use classifications, and then try to determine if agroforestry might be available. There's also state agency websites that publish information more so for extension, whether that be to go to landowners or consulting foresters, NRCS, whoever it may be that's working with landowners. And then lastly, I did include academic and gray literature. This is slightly limited when it comes to agroforestry, but there's quite a bit related to forest property tax programs. In that document analysis, I extracted information about the programs, as well as eligibility requirements, such as which landowners were able to qualify, productivity requirements. So did you have to have a certain amount of forest cover, or did you have to sell a certain amount of crops each year? Did you have to have a management plan? And how did that program lower the tax or property tax value of that property? And lastly, if landowners would be fined or penalized for noncompliance or disqualification. To be able to determine if agroforestry was allowed or a specific type of agroforestry was allowed, I coded land use characteristics. And this was something that I had a conversation with focus group participants, as well as the collaborators at the National Agroforestry Center, of since agroforestry practices may not be in property tax legislation, how could we be able to determine if a practice may or may not be allowed? So we determined that we would identify the characteristics of these land use systems and see if they're prohibited or permitted. And so we identified forestry related characteristics, so whether timber or non-timber species were permitted, agricultural related characteristics such as crops, grazing, inclusion of fallow land or buffers, and then lastly, general management characteristics such as if you can include your home dwelling in your assessment, and kind of the make it or break it for agroforestry. Can agriculture and forestry exist in the same space? And I coded these again according to their if they were prohibited or non-prohibited by this program. So specifically, I determined if they were unacceptable, so not permitted or rarely permitted, acceptable, so this might be allowed within a certain amount, or permitted but not the primary objective of that program. And then lastly, emphasized, which are going to be largely that main objective of the program, or something that's actually mentioned by name and encouraged. So some general results. So 6 of the 10 programs require a minimum acreage. 3 require a minimum income. These are largely the agricultural related, because we don't see as often forestry requiring an annual income. But a lot of these forestry programs do require a stocking or canopy cover requirement. Most of the programs use some kind of income-based methodology. So that net present value, for example, for forestry, or cash rent, and capitalizing that to determine that taxable value. And on the good side, each of the agroforestry practices may qualify, from most to least, I guess, commonly allowed, or what we assume would be commonly allowed, included civil pasture, followed closely by alley cropping, forest farming, and windbreaks. And it's a little bit of a red herring that riparian forest buffers are listed last, because a lot of states actually have their own specific policy or program or land use classification for riparian lands. So I'll mention that. Oregon's a great case study. So I know this is a lot. This is just an example of what one of our result tables look like, and all the Y's represent yes, that agroforestry practice may be allowed. And so we see, a civil pasture, windbreak, alley cropping, riparian forest buffers, forest farming, all have pretty decent coverage or potential coverage in these programs. Riparian forest buffers have some stars, and that's again because for example, North Carolina, their present use value program has a wildlife or classification, or wildlife conservation classification, and they include riparian lands in that. So it's not considered forest. It's not considered agriculture. It has its own designation. And in Oregon, riparian lands to a certain amount are actually exempt from property taxes. And so riparian lands are their own, I think, interesting subset, because I think they have a longer social acceptance, or it's been more, it's discussed longer, of the importance of protecting the land surrounding rivers and streams, as well as water bodies in general. So before I go back to Oregon as a case study, kind of just the general takeaways is we did see the most opportunity for agroforestry in those agricultural classifications. And that's because a lot of times, if you have a farm, you can include a small woodlot, or a woodlot whose best use is not timber, in your classification as farmland. But of course, that's limited to, like, you can't include a 100-acre forest generally. That's going to be small woodlots. And obviously, the most opportunities would exist if for landowners that if these programs do not have acreage constraints, as well as income constraints. Challenges. So kind of the inverse of each of those, the crop production as well as the grazing of livestock characteristics were largely prohibited on forest lands in the pilot states. And so this limited different types of agroforestry from being able to qualify. Also, many of these programs had acreage requirements specifically tied to a land use, and not really clear on if it can have multiple land uses. Some were clear in that as long as it didn't deter from the main objective, like timber production, for example, that they could be allowed. So that's a great example for grazing of livestock. Sometimes they would mention that it's allowed, but it cannot affect the timber production. And then lastly, the productivity criteria would be a challenge for agroforestry adopters. And this could be whether you're qualifying for agriculture, so that annual income, or if you're trying to qualify as a forest and you're supposed to meet a specific stocking rate, planting density, or forest cover. And so coming back to Oregon, Oregon again had 2 different forest land programs. So the forest land program is available to landowners with at least 2 acres or 2 contiguous acres, whereas the small tract forest land program is available to landowners with 10 to 5,000 acres. Both of these require that there's an adequate stocking depending on that stand characteristics, as well as site indices and characteristics. Use valuation, so that present use value was utilized to determine that modified assessment amount for the property. And there is economic benefit for qualifying in the small tract forest land program, because you're then taxed at 20% of the forest land value that you would utilize for the forest land program. So you're being taxed at a fraction of that value in the small tract program. Farms, it's interesting, because Oregon, I'm sure you all are much more familiar than I am growing up on the East Coast, but it largely was divided between Eastern and Western Oregon for if landowners could qualify in what's called an exclusive farm use zone or non-exclusive farm use zone. If you're within that zone, you do not have to have a minimum or maximum acreage to qualify. But if you're not, then depending on your farm size, you would have to meet a specific income requirement. So for example, if you fall in that middle class, the 6.5 to 30 acres, you would have to gross $100 in income from your land per acre per year in 3 of the 5 years before you apply for that preferential assessment. So it's not necessarily every year, but it can be quite difficult if you have, for example, forest farming, and you may not be able to produce what you need from mushrooms or whatever it is you're cultivating in your in the forest cover. It also has the special farm woodlots designation that you can include woodlots up to a 20-acre size, and it's not required to meet that minimum stocking rate. And you could potentially transition to the forest land classification. And I forgot to mention this, but when mentioned that there's more opportunity for agriculture or for agroforestry to qualify as agricultural classification than forestry, there is a benefit to getting that forest designation as opposed to an agriculture designation. That's because of the nature of these programs. We know a lot of times that agriculture can produce income sooner than forestry, and a lot of those benefits that we get from agriculture are incorporated and integrated into its market price more so than the public benefits in forestry. And so for this reason, generally forests have experience higher tax benefits than agricultural programs. But there are cases, obviously, where forestry is seen as agriculture. So a lot of that is, I was able to derive from that initial Kilgore paper. So I know this is a lot too. I just wanted to point out the use here, because I think that's where the break it story is for agroforestry. And they all happen to fall under the forest land program. So the HF and DF columns, that's the highest best use forest designation, and then designated forest designation of the forest land program. So this was just to show that there wasn't any differences between the forest programs. But we do see those red box or U's where it's unacceptable, and that's producing agricultural crops as well as including land that's fallow, not planted. And so that can have some implications for agroforestry producers. And we see obviously a lot more acceptable and no unacceptable, at least in these terms of these characteristics, under the exclusive farm use zone and non-exclusive farm use zone. And so if you're interested in this, as the other states are more about Oregon, this has been published in Trees, Forests, People. And I did share these slides, so I didn't share the link for this, but I can share that, or you're able to look it up from here. And just briefly, one of the goals of the phase 2, a part of this project was to try to incorporate a methodology that would allow us to understand how these characteristics or how characteristics of land use or land ownership, as well as environmental characteristics of programs, were captured in property taxes. And so this was going to be more assessed from interviews with experts, because most of these property tax programs were developed over 50 years ago. While climate change might not have been on the minds of the legislators that adapted this, or that wasn't the purpose of these policies, that's not to say that I am interpreting the intention of any policy, just that the environmental benefits were generally not the focus, at least in my small pilot phase. It was mostly production oriented benefits. And because this is public programs, they generally cannot discriminate between individuals. So there's not going to be language that says, oh, this type of group or this person would get different benefits than another. So that was the hopes. We're unfortunately unable to identify enough interviewees to be able to report on those, but we did find some interesting information that has been published on largely with the literature related to our African American landowners in the Southeast and some of the struggles that they have accessing technical knowledge as well as incentive programs. And also, I just wanted to show what I have changed in the information I'm coding or the characteristics I'm coding. So I wanted to differentiate between riparian forest buffers and windbreaks or shelter belts and alley cropping. So I did differentiate between buffers that are used or linear plantings of trees for non-riparian areas and riparian. And lastly, I wanted to also look into if leasing was permitted because I thought that might have some social implications. Oh, and just to mention, you'll see lines, dashes. That's because we don't have this focus group pool or experts to be able to send our results to verify or to get further information on. Because of the scale of the project at this point in time, we added a code that's basically a dash to say this is not specified in the statute or the manual. And so we're really unable to make a judgment call on if this specific characteristic is acceptable, not acceptable, or emphasized. Well, I guess it's not emphasized if it's not mentioned. And our hopes is that we can publish a general technical report with this information that could be educational or useful for resource or natural resource professionals, landowners, and maybe the tax community, at least to create a discussion on how agroforestry may or may not be eligible for these existing programs or where there may need to be changes. Because actually, when I completed phase 1, I was able to learn that in New York, they added forest farming for maple production, as well as I believe silvopasture to their forest program. I'd have to double check because I wasn't looking back at it. I was looking more at Oregon, but they did have a recent change, which is not quite common since it is quite difficult to change these since these are all tied to legislation. And in my last few minutes, I just wanted to briefly talk about carbon markets as well as one other opportunity. So unfortunately, I do not know of a carbon market opportunity that's available in the Northwest region. Although I do have one that's available in the Southeast, and the methodology they're using is used in projects in the voluntary market that could be done technically anywhere. So maybe there is some hope that this could be utilized, or the same approach can be used in another region. But specifically, there's a group called Working Trees, and they've created a carbon market that's paying landowners for the carbon stored in trees established in a silvopasture. And so to show that there's this carbon benefit, you have to be planting trees that's been on land that's been in pasture for at least 10 years to show that you're not just reforesting. So there's an actual carbon drawdown. They're using Vera's methodology for afforestation, reforestation, and revegetation. It's available to landowners in the eastern part of the country, so east of the Great Plains. For those of you that are familiar with some of the maybe problems, sorry, my dogs are barking, hopefully you don't hear that, there's one concern about or worry when enrolling in carbon markets, and that's what happens when there's a natural disaster, whether it be a wildfire, forest, or hurricane in my region, whatever it may be. When you have this unexpected loss of trees and potentially that loss of carbon, this program, you would submit to your credits, some of them to a buffer pool, and that way, if you do lose some of your forest crop, that you would maybe not be penalized, or you might just not receive your income depending on how severe it is. And you would be expected to enroll for 30 years, and this is available to landowners of any size. There's one other one, Carbon Harvest, that I just found for a presentation that I was doing the other day, actually for this, researching. I've been working on multiple presentations, so I got a little confused, but it's also only available in Southern Appalachia, but it includes multiple forms of agroforestry, so not just silvopastures. So I'm hopeful that there will be more movement in this for agroforestry in these markets, as we have seen, obviously, internationally, as in a lot of the voluntary carbon market does have projects related to agroforestry practices. And then lastly, is it interesting that there was a comment about climate smart commodities early in the announcements. So this is just one other opportunity that, obviously is a part of some of the recent legislation. There's been a lot of funding that's available or has come available for natural resources. So the Climate Smart Commodities Partnerships Program through the USDA, they funded $3.1 billion to support 141 projects that would last about from 1 to 5 years. This connect or to help support the production and marketing of climate smart commodities, help landowners access these markets. Includes various agroforestry practices, all of which that I had mentioned earlier, and more that they consider, at least that would fall under agroforestry establishment. And there's 3 active projects, so you can look on this dashboard. Again, unfortunately, they're all on the eastern side, but I'm hopeful when they do the next round, maybe there'll be some projects in your region. And so that, I just want to thank you and open the floor for any questions or discussion.
Thanks, Stephanie. That was awesome. Appreciate that. So we have till the end of the hour for questions. I wrote down a few questions of my own. But I want to give the floor to the broader group first and see if anyone else wants to kick things off. That was a really excellent presentation.
Thank you.
Oh, looks like Laura had her hand raised briefly, or maybe that was clapping.
It's so hard to tell what those are.
It was clapping. I really enjoyed that. Thank you.
All right.
I just want to point out that Warren posted a paper in the chat that I couldn't tell if that was a paper you were involved with, Stephanie, or if it's just supplemental.
That is the title, so I assume that it is.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Well, I can kick things off. You kind of answered some of these as we went through, but I was wondering if have you seen, like in your research, any examples of policies that were retrofitted to allow agroforestry? You mentioned that one towards the end that kind of allowed for, I think, silvopasture maybe.
Yeah.
So like I said, that's one example, but like it sounds like that's really uncommon. Do you have any other examples?
I don't. I mean, other than North Carolina, that wildlife conservation classification that was recently added, and obviously it wasn't directly to include agroforestry in any means, but it included obviously riparian forest lands for their habitat benefits. And so that's the only one that I've seen that made recent changes. Now, again, that's from a sample of 5 states. I couldn't unfortunately focus as much on the what has encouraged change in policy for the phase 2 with these remaining 45 states. That would be great. It was hard to identify the information, and largely it was identified through those experts because they were informed on what it took. For example, with New York, the Farm Bureau was pretty important in leveraging that policy change. And again, it all comes back to because these programs are all fiscal, and so they generally are going to be related to direct legislation. That obviously it would require, unless that or the organization that responsible for that policy or that program has the power to adapt it, that it would require legislation change to update the program.
Yeah, and that is incredibly difficult. And then you kind of touched on it a little bit. One comment I had, not so much a question, was on the slide where you showed the frequency of practices based on policy. I was really surprised to see working riparian buffers at the bottom, because that would seem to be the one that has the most overlap with state conservation goals of protecting waterways, but yet the policies don't really seem to line up with that.
Yeah, and I think it's again because they don't. I mean, at times there's certain situations where riparian forest buffers it's included in whether forestry or agriculture classification. But I think it's because of the fact that a lot of times these have been seen separately. So I'm seeing more instances in the second phase where riparian lands or riparian forest buffers actually have their own designation. So I think it'd be interesting to look at how that came about, because I don't, obviously there's, when you're reading the statutes, it doesn't tell you on what promoted this policy to come into or to come about. And so that would be interesting. And I think an interesting research question is why is riparian forest buffers, and how have they, the policies around them been developed, and what it took to develop those?
That would be extremely valuable, I think. So Warren has a question in the chat, and feel free, anyone, if you don't feel like speaking up, you're more than welcome to type in the chat. I could read off the questions. So yes, do you see any federal funding from the Farm Bill that we could assist in advocating for, either as individuals or as local work groups?
So I haven't looked, unfortunately, I haven't had the time to look through the newest version of the Farm Bill that's being that has been, I guess, up for debate for a while. So I need to look at that, if that's the version that you're referencing, if it's the prior version. I mean, obviously, I would say, the Inflation Reduction Act, it has allocated a massive amount of money to some of those Farm Bill programs, and some of them will allow for tree establishment. And so if you're planting trees to create a silvopasture, obviously I don't generally recommend thinning a forest to create silvopasture, but you have to do it some way. But some of these practices where you could it's not necessarily for agroforestry, but it could help develop an agroforestry or agroforest system. That would be, I would look into those. So specifically thinking about maybe EQIP or
CSP.
Say the CRP, yes. So CRP is not going to be, but yes, CS. One of those where you're looking at cost sharing some of those tree planting activities, because that's generally, I think, what you're going to find. Although I was surprised to see that in that climate smart commodities, the practices, which are from, I think, a lot from the Farm Bill practices, that even like windbreak renovation was included. And so I would look into those specific programs and the practices and see, because they do change, and they have changed recently to account for climate benefits. So there's been a lot of changes in those existing programs. So even before, obviously, our new version of the Farm Bill.
Yeah. And it is exciting. There's more agroforestry or money for agroforestry now than ever. But we still need a lot more.
Yes.
So Greg asked, this is a good question, and it was something on my mind while you were giving your presentation. In terms of property taxation in many states, that is controlled by local government, which would complicate any integration of forestry and agriculture, wouldn't it? So yeah, I mean, so a lot of those programs, like, yeah, I'm in Washington. So one of ours is the designated forest land program, which is very analogous to one of the ones that you mentioned in Oregon. And it's kind of run by each county assessor, and they get to decide, can you do silvopasture here or not? And that's what we've been encountering. And sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. I mean, how have you seen that play out nationally? Is it really up to the local assessor a lot of the time?
Yeah. So I was just thinking before this of what other questions can I have? And I think a really cool, interesting, a really cool research experiment would be to draw up like a survey instrument to send to county assessors where we create some fictional or theoretical agroforestry systems and have them ask them, would this qualify or not, and see how often they would align between the counties. Because, as I mentioned, one of the documents that we utilized and heavily utilized were these manuals that were generally produced, published by the Department of Revenue in a state. So they have this entity at the state level that creates the rules related to property taxation, and then they disseminate that to the county level, and it's up to the county to interpret that. And so some of these manuals are hundreds of pages, some of them are 30 pages, and so it just shows you how much leeway or is room or room for interpretation. And that's really, I think, it really would have been the most informative of this if we wanted to get kind of, I guess, the most hopefully accurate interpretation of these programs, and how these types of lands would be assessed and classified would be to go to the county assessor. Because even though, yes, the states generally are the ones that are at least create the property tax, it's levied at the county level. And so it just depends on that state and how much authority they give to their local government. And Hawaii is interesting because they don't have a state property tax. It's all done at the county level. They fortunately only have 4 counties, at least, that have these programs. So it somewhat increased my sample size, because I said I want to include it and don't exclude it. But yeah, so it even depends on the state on how that property taxation occurs.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I would think too that maybe that's an opportunity for advocates to make a changes when all those assessors meet. I know Washington has an assessors like conference or association meeting annually, and I've thought about how can we get agroforestry like on the presentation docket, or if there's some sort of national, I don't know if there's a national assessors conference. Sounds like kind of a boring conference, but it would be a really great opportunity to just kind of get them thinking about mixed land use in general.
I agree.
Yeah. All right, so let's see. So we got lots of comments in the chat, really good comments, including from Dana. Hi, Dana, in Thurston County. So we have some county representation here to talk about how that looks on the local scale. Feel free to chime in at any point, ask more questions, comment, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, just from a local county perspective, we had to create a new program in order to kind of fit some of the gaps for the state program for our county and what we felt we had jurisdiction over, I guess. And I'm very new to the process, but I know we just adapted our local program to be more inclusive of agriculture practices because it's a conservation focused like easement program for open space. And so it'd be interesting to see how agroforestry could align with that. And I think because it's in that kind of habitat and agriculture, I wonder how we can interpret that and combine those uses, because they're kind of separated into categories, just like you said. And then the other piece is that our new forest conversion ordinance allows for agriculture and forestry, and we just are in the process of updating it. Going to the board. So the only hitch is there's no penalty to do agriculture and forestry together, and having a management plan is the requirement.
Mm-hmm.
So hopefully that's kind of new and fun.
Yeah,
that's really cool.
Yeah, that's super exciting, and Thurston can be kind of a model, hopefully, for
that. Yeah, I've not heard. I mean, obviously with easements, I've seen conservation easements at the county level. I don't see as much about property taxation outside of that Hawaii situation. That's because when they got rid of the state, the counties were given the power to levy that and control those programs. So it's interesting to hear. So for the county, did any of the changes affect a property taxation, or is it just the ordinance and then easements?
Yeah, no, nothing to affect property taxation yet. We have just done a canopy study and are sifting through our data to see what that shows us. And when we kind of see what that shows us, one of our next goals is to actually approach our, our cities within our county and ask them, what does this look like? When we're talking about mitigation, we're talking about carbon. Can we run a local program? Cities have a harder time growing trees. We have extra space. How do we make this work out? And that's kind of our next steps, and using that data to say, yeah, to really lead that discussion and lead those decisions. So hopefully we just can bring our board to a place where they have the information they need to make a good decision.
Thanks, Dana. Does anybody else? We got a few more minutes left. If anyone else has a final question for Stephanie, give it a second or two. But
I did see Zach's comment about the climate smart commodities. So it could be the why it only shows the specific like 3 projects in certain states is that was from the first round of funding, and it may not actually reflect all of where they're putting in the practices, but more so where their partners are at. You can't, at least as far as I can tell from the dashboard, you can't like get super specific on one project. You can, I mean, it provides like who the summaries of what partners are available, but not necessarily the full study plan to know exactly where they're implementing practices.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is a little clunky of a dashboard. So I actually work for Organic Valley on our partnerships grant. So I saw that there were no West Coast states on there. I was like, wait, I know that we're doing, or we can do agroforestry work on the West Coast on Organic Valley member farms. So I think if you filter by the middle column, the practice list, you'll see all of the states where those practices can be applied.
Thank you, because I definitely filtered by agroforestry, and so the commodity, like you mentioned,
which that'll only give you the projects where, yeah, exactly. Like our program would show up under dairy as the commodity, but we're doing a whole suite of different conservation practices, including agroforestry.
That makes sense. Thank you for letting me know that, because that's definitely, I plan on doing a talk for Yale's Forest Forum on where I'm going to talk about climate smart commodities. So I definitely want to get it right when I'm presenting. Not that I didn't want to get it right for this presentation, but don't want to make the same mistake twice.
Zach, I'd love to talk with you more about what agroforestry looks like on some of our dairies in the region. Super interesting.
Yeah, we can definitely have that conversation. And yeah, let's connect. We'd love to talk to
you. So Greg asked a really interesting question I never thought about. Does anyone think about carbon offsets for animal fibers produced by silvopasturing? So animal fibers are about 60% carbon and lock away the carbon in the vegetation. I'd never really considered that. We're always thinking about trees. So, maybe in the scale of things, it's less, but it is still carbon.
That's I obviously have a biased background, not in my biased by what I enjoy, but because I come from a forestry background, I'm more familiar with the carbon offset markets or projects that include forestry practices. One thing that I've had on my to-do list is to look more into the agricultural practices or markets for agricultural activities, because that would be interesting to know if I'm missing anything for agroforestry that's listed on the ag side. So I have, if that's been talked about, it maybe have been more on the agriculture side, and I haven't seen those. But in all of the practices and methodologies that I've looked at, I've never seen any kind of accounting for animal fibers, but that would be fascinating to see.
Right. Yeah. Just quick follow-up question. In general, like I know a lot of this carbon market stuff is still new and developing, but do you think that agroforestry would be perhaps more attractive than some forestry projects just because it's so much easier to prove additionality, which is such a problem with a lot of these forest projects?
I think that's why we have seen the first, like, for example, that working trees where it's specifically like this is afforestation. So there shouldn't be as much of a worry about the additionality of carbon as there are, for example, with reforestation projects. Because it's like, how can you show that the landowner was not going to replant or that this was going to get converted to a non-forest use? And so I think it has maybe less, especially these public obstacles now where we've lost faith in some of these methodologies as well as carbon markets related to forestry, but even also, clean energy, whatever the other projects, especially in other parts of the world. And so I think it could potentially have less pushback, but there will be pushback in the sense of course, that age-old conversation about there's worrying about, are we reducing production of food? So are we limiting our amount of monocultures of agricultural land? And we know we have this food demand and we're incorporating trees. We'll have to prove that we can be just as productive. Or that if we can't, that the benefits from those trees that are in that system are worth the loss of that food for consumption or for agriculture or for livestock production.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good point. All right, well, we should close it out there and let you get on with the rest of your day. I guess it is 6 o'clock where you're at, and you're probably ready for dinner. So I really appreciate you being free, able to work a late day for us. And it's an excellent presentation. So I do have Stephanie's slides, and I'll send those out along with the recording of this either tomorrow or possibly the next day. So for anyone interested in those slides, and then I'm going to put Stephanie's email in the chat there, just assuming that you're open to getting follow-up questions if you want.
Absolutely. And I will be at SAF as well in Sacramento. So maybe I will see some of you there. I will not be presenting on agroforestry, unfortunately, but I will be presenting or co-presenting on incentive programs.
Okay, cool. That's great. Well, thank you again. Really appreciate it.
Thank you all. It was great. Thanks for the invitation. Have a great evening or afternoon for you all.
You too. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
You want to get us started on the next part, Carrie?
Yeah. So if you're able to stick around and turn on your cameras or speak up with any questions, topics for discussion, resources that you want to share with the group, we'll give a few minutes for people to, and also if you don't want to speak up and you just want to put something in the chat, we'll give people a few minutes to kind of think about what you might want to discuss with the group, or what we've got a lot of different expertise and stuff here represented. So it's a great time to, we can too start with introductions as well. Why don't we do that actually? Let's start with introductions so we can also kind of see who's here. So I'll start. I'm Carrie Browsick. I'm the president of Agroforestry Northwest. I'm an agroforester here in Washington State, and I also run an agroforestry program at Snohomish Conservation District. And we'll just do a little popcorn style maybe. I will throw it over to Margaret.
Hi, I'm Margaret Creeder. I'm a forester here at Mason Conservation District. So we do forestry, technical assistance, and plan writing, and trying to include more agroforestry in that. We work with our farm planner here, Nick Schneider, to try and meld the two worlds together.
And if you want to give it to someone, yeah.
Sure. Abel.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Abel Kloster, and I live in Oregon, and I'm a technical service provider. I have a company called Resilience Permaculture Design, and I do farm and forest planning and implementation work, and a big part of my passion and work is agroforestry. Yeah, thanks for having me. And let's see, maybe Kevin Dunham.
Thanks. My name's Kevin. I live on Whidbey Island, South Whidbey Island in Washington. And I have a small farm, 6 acres, and we're implementing a silvopasture on majority of it. We raise sheep and pigs and chickens and turkeys. And then I'm also in the middle of a permaculture design course through OSU and hoping to get some other properties on board on the island here with starting some silvopasture projects. We raise sheep on quite a few properties around the island and wanted to try and incorporate trees on some of them. I'll pass it off to Warren next.
Afternoon, Warren Neth, 2 hats I'll share about today. I have a consulting business, Cascadian Praxis, working on communications for organizations, telling local food stories and doing short supply chain consultancy. We're currently working with the Oregon Ocean Cluster Initiative, strengthening the short supply chain for Oregon seafood. But with this agroforestry work, I love the idea of connecting agroforestry and mariculture projects, that forest and ocean connection. I don't know, there's definitely something there. But I also have a small farm in Yelm, Washington, and we're going to be working with Patrick in the Thurston Conservation District to install an alley cropping system, focusing on aronia, green tea, and elderberry in our perennial hedges, and then a rotation of long season crops in the annual rows.
Well, who do you want to send it to, Warren?
Right, thanks. I'll go Mark, Bachelor.
Thank you guys. I apologize, my internet has started going out right at 3 o'clock and I have no idea what's going on. Anyways, my name is Mark Bachelor. I work with the National Agroforestry Center. I am the new research scientist focusing on ecosystem services and carbon sequestration, and currently based in Corvallis, Oregon. And I will pass it off to Laura.
Sorry, it cut out. Did you say Laura?
Yep.
Yes.
Oh, great. Excellent. Hooray. Hi, everyone. Sorry to blind all of you. My name is Laura Starr. I work for the Soil Health Division, NRCS. I represent Washington, Hawaii, and Alaska. And so I work for headquarters and I support the state efforts in sort of all things soil health. And I will pass it over to my supervisor, Joe.
Hi, everybody. I'm just like Laura, blinding everybody, including myself here. But again, my name's Joe Williams. I'm the West Team lead for the Soil Health Division with the Natural Resources Conservation Service. I'm actually based here in Olympia, Washington. So good to hear about Thurston County and all the other good stuff going on there too. But again, good to be here. And I'm going to turn it over to Tom Sauer. If Tom's another member of our team, and if Tom's still around, I'm going to turn it over to him.
I'm here. Thanks, Joe. Hi, everyone. I'm Tom Sauer. I'm ACES enrollee. So I retired from the Ag Research Service in December, and I work part-time supporting the Soil Health Division on forest soil health and agroforestry. And actually, in my research career in the Ag Research Service, I did a lot of work with tree windbreaks, silvopasture, riparian buffers, mainly looking at soil effects of those practices. And I'll pass it on to Greg.
Hi, I obviously am new to this group and really appreciate it. I have, among other things, I have a small family ranch on South Whidbey Island. And I am sort of in the middle of starting a silvopasturing project in converting an overly dense old logging forest to something that I can use for animal grazing. And I didn't know that Kevin was part of this group, but I think we're scheduled to visit with one another, Kevin, soon. And it sounds like we should go out to lunch or something, or a beer, and talk a lot about what we have in common.
Greg, did you want to pick someone to go next?
Gosh, I'm sorry. I forgot I was supposed to do that. How about Margaret?
I think she already went. I know, let's see, who hasn't gone? Jared hasn't gone, Hollis hasn't gone. I don't think Zach or Dana have gone. Well, why don't we start with Hollis then?
Hey, Hollis Crapo. I'm work for the Department of Natural Resources in the Small Forest Landowner Office. I do regulation assistance covering the Northwest region. And agroforestry is a personal interest, and particularly the overlap in policy and regulation. So it's this was a very, very interesting topic presentation today. Also, if you're in 5 counties northeast or northwest Washington, please reach out. I'd love to talk to you about how you're implementing it and what problems you run into, especially in terms of regulation or policy and stuff like that.
All right, I'm gonna just pick from here. Dana, do you want to go next?
Sure thing. I work with Thurston County, and I'm a planner. I'm a fairly new planner, so kind of a bull in a china shop with regards to policy, but it's kind of fun. And I also come from a conservation district background. I work for Stevens Conservation District, and I have an education and communications kind of bent to my work. So I really want to involve the community. So I appreciate you reaching out. Oh, I think he jumped off. Oh no, Warren, there you are. I appreciate you reaching out, Warren, and I'll connect with you shortly. And yeah, just really excited about especially agroforestry, because I just bought 6 acres in Margaret's neck of the woods that has 2 acres of class 1 wetlands, 2 acres of open, and 2 acres of forest. Yeah, living the dream. So I'm excited to be part of this group and learn about all the things and just make pathways for people, because people want to take care of the land.
Nice. Zach, do you want to go next?
Certainly. Yep. So Zach Spangler, like I mentioned before, I work for Organic Valley as a on-farm carbon reduction manager, part of our new Climate Smart Commodities grant, standing that up, where we are hoping to pay member farms for implementing silvopasture, allied cropping, agroforestry, large working trees is helping us with some of that work. So all of what she was mentioning at the end there. My focus is more on the manure management side and kind of carbon reduction rather than sequestration, but my agroforestry focused colleague is on the East Coast, so a bit hard for her to join these calls. So I also have just a deep personal interest in all of the really amazing agroforestry work that's happening in the Northwest. And I'm based in Seattle now, and it's just so cool to hear about the fascinating systems that people are coming up with. So yeah, really enjoy these calls for that.
Awesome. Thanks, Zach. Jared, you haven't gone yet, I don't think.
Nope. Yeah. So Jared Boozen, live here in Everett, Washington, and I'm a agroforestry intern with the Snohomish Conservation District, working with Carrie. Also a small forest landowner, and my wife and I are going to start our big leaf maple syrup production this coming season.
That's exciting.
Mm-hmm.
If I can help with that, just let me know.
Will do.
John, you want to go next?
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, how's everybody doing? Good to see you again. I'm a grower at the Washington Association of Conservation Districts Plant Material Center. Some of you have had the fun time of visiting up here recently, and it was super great to see you and super great to host you. I get interested in, like, I grow a number of trees and hardwoods, conifers that definitely lend themselves to agroforestry applications, and it's just super fun to grow such a wide variety of Pacific Northwest native plants. It's going to be chestnut U-pick season, so if you're in Skagit County, check out Lazy Squirrel, October 22nd. I think the following weekend as well, and go get yourself some chestnuts.
Nice. That's great. Let's see. Karishma, she did her introduction in the chat. She's doing some really cool stuff in the Key Peninsula, so check that out. Otherwise, I think Rebecca, I don't think you've introduced you. If you're on still, feel free to. Right.
Yeah, I'm on. Hey, I'm Becca Anderson Blanca. I am the NRCS Small Farms and Urban Agriculture Specialist. I'm based out of Olympia, but I cover the state. And, you know, a lot of folks are coming in with requests for guidance on silvopasture and agroforestry and everything. And so, you know, any of the landowners who are on the call, holler at me and we'll get you connected with your local planner, because, you know, we have technical assistance we can help you out with. And then we also have a lot of financial assistance programs. You know, in the talk earlier, she mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act. And so I put a link in the chat for the fiscal year 24 practices that Inflation Reduction Act can cover the cost of, or, you know, partial reimbursement, right? Yeah, and so there's a lot of really, really cool stuff going on. Would love to get connected with people. And then to the permies who are on the call, I'm also a permie, and I went through my permaculture design course in Texas. So good to see y'all on here.
I think it's the first time I've heard the phrase permies. Probably. Yeah.
It's a good one. Yeah.
Aaron, I think you're the last one. If you're on and want to give yourself a quick introduction, feel free to. Great.
Sure thing. Hi, everyone. Sorry I was late. My name's Aaron. I'm a NRCS staff as well, a soil conservationist on the Northwest team in Washington State. So that's my vocation. And in my personal endeavors, I strive to signal boost emerging biotechnologies and promote cultural practices that eliminate the false dichotomy of human versus nature. And yeah, I'm here to work with others to develop strategies on the ground in applying agroforestry and accessing federal programs to do that.
That's awesome. I'm pumped by how much NRCS and federal representation we have here today. We also have a good mix of landowners and conservation districts. This is a great mix. So Carrie, do we want to, where do we go from here? You want to just do?
Yeah, no, I think, yeah, I mean, that took a little bit of time, but I think it was good just to kind of see, you know, who's out there working with agroforestry and, you know, who's in our area and who we can connect with. So thanks for taking some time to just introduce yourself. And yeah, it's a great way to make some connections.
Great.
Two, I just want to mention really quick, and I'm thinking of this because we had an agroforestry farm walk up in Arlington, in, you know, sort of the north part of Puget Sound here, a couple weeks ago, and I think that that Agroforestry Northwest website could serve as a great place to centralize some information about agroforestry tours or events or things like that going on in the area. So feel free, if you guys are hosting a tour or you're doing a farm walk or you're going to do a webinar or something about agroforestry, feel free to let us know. And we can also amplify that on our website too. And that's just can be a great kind of centralized place for people to take a look at what's kind of going on in our state around agroforestry. I think that's been one of our challenges with you know, all the funding going to the East Coast or the Midwest is been sort of showing that centralized sort of full picture of all the agroforestry that is happening in our region. So yeah, just keeping that in mind. And yeah, opening up the floor to any questions or comments or anything else anyone wants to throw out there.
Yeah, I just want to add too that we can also send it out if you have events on our listserv. And
Yep.
you know, we had about 25 people here, but that listserv is about 125 or so now.
Yeah.
So, you know, we can get the word out to folks that are interested in agroforestry.
Yeah, and feel free to mention to others that you know too, that they can join the listserv, they can, that this can be a great central place to find out good. That's part of what we're trying to do, is build a good central location for folks to find out what the happenings are around agroforestry. So yeah.
Is this a appropriate time to just ask technical, like alley cropping questions?
Sure.
Yeah, we can brainstorm
Go
that.
for it.
Yeah.
All right. I just emailed you, Carrie, so I'll just follow up with you in direct. You were doing the alley cropping plantings up in your area with some local farms. I think you worked with people that did aronia, and I was wondering if you had any kind of favorite kind of guidance on planting, spacing, soil, and that kind of stuff. I kind of find it all over the map for particularly aronia, and so if you had any kind of technical guides that you really were most drawn towards that would kind of help, would be interested to see that.
Yeah, so you're doing an alley cropping?
Yeah.
What are you doing in the alleys?
A rotational of long season crops. Gonna do flowers. What is gonna be a big focus, but then like beans and things.
Okay. Yeah, with aronia, we've typically been doing 6-foot spacing in the rows. And I think you see kind of, you mentioned sort of all over the map, kind of where is it, what soils is it appropriate for, and all of those kinds of things. Aronia is really cool because it's super hardy, and we find it being appropriate for a lot of different conditions. It can tolerate some super wet feet. It can tolerate some dry ground. You know, once it gets established, it's a pretty hardy shrub and a pretty good producer. So yeah, I think, you know, you probably can't go wrong with it. But yeah,
and really wide variance in the varieties too, wide range, and so
yeah. So if you're, you know, if you're keyed in on some of the more commercial varieties, I know the varieties we've been using are Viking, Narrow, and oh gosh, it's like miniature aronia or dwarf aronia. It has a smaller berry but super productive. Yeah, and if anyone else has anything to add about aronia, feel free to jump in.
If there's any test plots in the Northwest, that'd be interesting. I don't know if there's anything up north or.
Yeah, we've just done this last planting season. I want to say 4 plantings that include aronia. Some of those plantings are like a mixed species within the rows too. I think you might have mentioned that, Warren. Are you mixing species within your row? Or are you doing like single aronia sort of?
I am interplanting green tea, aronia, and elderberry.
Okay.
Is what you need focus. So.
And that'd be interesting. Yeah, I get the green tea is going to be a much slower grower. And I'm finding with green tea where I plant it, the varieties that do okay in the Pacific Northwest, they do a lot better with some shade, with some protection. Yeah. They can hang on okay, sort of out there in the open sun, but the varieties I've worked with and that I've planted and seen do so much better if they've got a little shade, a little protection around them. So figuring out where you can tuck the green tea in, like maybe next to the elderberry or something where it's going to receive some shade.
Would you
Yeah, I
recommend?
have some that are like 15 years old that are like 4 feet tall, really happy underneath a pawpaw tree.
Yeah. Yeah.
Would you recommend like a light overstory, like a taller overstory of, you know, maybe alder or like chestnut or like something for that?
For green
in
tea?
an alley cropping scenario for green tea, you know?
Yeah, I think an alley cropping scenario with a taller, like dappled shade kind of overstory plant, like, yeah, maples, alder,
Persimmon.
nuts, persimmons. Yeah. Yeah, they do really well in those conditions.
I've only seen green tea as like a hedge basically, because that's how you kind of cut it. Does it create like a fully formed shrub? Like how tall will it?
Yeah, what's interesting and there's some different varieties. There's varieties that will grow more into a tree shape. There's varieties that'll grow more into or more like a tree, varieties that really lend themselves well to pruning into a very nice kind of shrub or hedge. So it kind of depends on the varieties. They can grow in a lot of different forms. So yeah, it can kind of be appropriate to, I guess they can grow in a lot of different forms and can handle a lot of pruning into various shapes. So yeah, they're kind of cool because you can kind of morph them and stick them and fit them where you need them to go, with that protection. Yeah.
Well, as Warren mentioned, he and I are going to be working together on a sustainable farms and fields project for alley cropping. So we'll probably throw those plans by you to get your thoughts.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Super excited for that, Warren, by the way.
Yeah. Abel, did you guys plant anything down at Jared's with Aronia?
No. At this point, as far as I know, Jared's hedgerows are all native.
Okay.
Coastal shrubs, yeah.
Mark threw something in the chat here. Do you want to just speak to that, Mark, or?
Sure. I just came back from the Finger Lakes region, where extension staff from Cornell put on a training for silvopasture, and it was a 3-day training. And the beauty of that, and I apologize if there's gaps in my speech because my internet is just crappy today. The beauty of that training was primarily for professionals, quote unquote. So there were foresters, there were ag specialists, there was their version of conservation districts, and it was a training amongst the professionals, and so we were training each other regarding establishment of silvopasture, forestry concerns, soil concerns, erosion. I would just like to I think we had 30 people there for 3 days. It was a fantastic success, and I think about 150 people actually wanted to come to the meeting. It wasn't a moneymaker for really anybody, but it was an excellent opportunity for in-depth discussions around agroforestry practices. And I know that one of the things that came out of that, one of the takeaways that came out of that was something that's happening here in this meeting, but actually, people coming together and discussing ideas, best practices. I know that there was a couple people that came out of it, figuring out how they could fund new projects or seek funding. So I just want to see if folks on this call or Zoom, whatever it is, would be interested in having a training like that, either in Washington or Oregon.
raise your hand if you'd be interested.
I'm feeling most people.
Yeah, I think that would be incredible. And yeah, we should explore getting something like that put together. And yeah. And two, if anyone's interested in collaborating on putting something like that together as well, it'd be great. Reach out to us and we could talk about what it would look like.
Yeah.
I'll just throw one more thing out there, and I think Carrie and Patrick are a really great place, and so are NRCS folks, and the conservation districts to kind of put that on. And as a representative of the National Agroforestry Center, I'd be more than willing to come out and help facilitate if necessary. But really, it comes down to locals only. Really, you guys are the where the rubber meets the road, and seeing what's happening out in the East Coast and the Midwest with agroforestry, this area is ripe, especially when we see NRCS and CDs and landowners collaborate on extension. Sorry, I keep forgetting about extension. Sorry, Patrick, and whoever else is extension on here. You guys are phenomenal individuals as well. But that's really the formula that I see in other parts of the United States. And TSPs. I realize there's TSPs on here, and entities like Organic Valley. We had a few of you guys there that week as well. So I know that the big grants are out there, and those big grants aren't. While they're supporting the adoption of great practices and measurements, such as carbon sequestration, I think really what this potential, just looking at the names are on here, is collaboration regarding trainings that lead to best management practices and future funding. So
yeah. And I do want to address, I know we're at time, so if you got to run, that's fine. But I do want to address Kevin's comment about the Agroforestry Northwest webpage and the section on silvopasture. We are working on filling out our webpage and making it more robust. We are happy to feature any projects that you all have on our webpage. If you want to send us some pictures and a little paragraph or a few sentences about any projects you have on your own farms or that you're working with landowners or whatever, we can keep things confidential as well. We're not going to throw people's addresses up there or anything. But yeah, we're happy to feature whatever your agroforestry projects are on our webpage as well. So feel free to send us any of that.
Yeah, that would be great.
Best place to send that.
So what was that?
Where would be the best place to send that?
Well, you can send it directly to Carrie or I'll put my address, my email in the chat, and you also have it. Probably from the emails sending out the link for this meeting, but you could send it directly to me.
I think we're at time. Unless anyone else has any other great pressing concerns at the moment. We do have another great presenter, I think, in December coming up. We do this every other month, and we will be working to plan next year's presenters and work group meetings, and we'll start to get those posted out on the website as well. So watch for that. And two, if you have any ideas of folks that you would like to see present at this work group, or you have any topics that you want to bring to the discussion portion, reach out and let us know that as well.
Yeah.
But thanks everyone for attending. It was great seeing everyone. We had a great crew today, and yeah, we'll hopefully see y'all next time or hear from you in between.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks everybody. Take it easy.
Bye everybody.
Bye.